Thank you, Anne. Thanks everyone for coming, for attending this webinar, especially participants from Ukraine, given this really difficult situation there, as was already mentioned by Anne. Before starting the presentation, I think I also have to start with the words of acknowledgement about this project, very important initiative of how the universities can join their forces to help Ukraine in the environmental recovery. And I'm particularly honored and feel really privileged to be invited here among the very, very distinguished speakers of different GROMADA webinars throughout this series. I specifically want to thank Anne for personally inviting me here. And I hope that today's topic will be interesting and also useful for people attending or whoever will listen to it later. I'll try to share the screen now and okay. Yes, I hope it's on full screen now. Anne, can you confirm that? Yes, okay, I see you. Yeah, I see your thumbs up. Thanks. So when we are talking about the topic, we decided to have it about the legal protection of wildlife in war, but largely speaking, it will be more about animals generally, not specifically to wildlife. However, we identified three main patterns of exploitation or abuse of animals during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, on which we will focus more specifically. So within the coming 25 or 30 minutes, I will first generally speak about the use of animals in armed conflicts, and then how this use of animals is regulated under international humanitarian law, if it is regulated at all. And then we focus on animal victims of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and as I already mentioned, outline three patterns of animal exploitation or abuse during the invasion. Every time I talk about the protection of animals in armed conflict, I have two main questions from very skeptic audience, I would say. The first is, where do we have animals in wars? Because the wars are fought between humans. And then the second question comes, even if we have animals in armed conflicts, why we should care about them? Because there is so many human suffering in armed conflict that it will be not morally or ethically justified to care more about animals. The answer, I will start answering from the second question. Obviously, the armed conflicts and wars bring huge suffering to humans and the human victims of war, which is really acknowledged and recognized. But the wars also bring a lot of suffering to animals. And caring more about animals does not necessarily mean to care less about humans. And the animal victims or acknowledging animal victimhood in war does not diminish the victimhood of human beings in wars. Those two paradigms should run in parallel, and the legal protection granted to humans to animals should not be seen as something depriving the legal protection from humans. So this is a kind of understanding on which the entire set of rules for animal protection should be read, whatever is available in international law so far, or whatever will be available if some of the initiatives will be put in practice in the future. Turning back to the first question, where do we have animals in wars? Well, the history documented a lot of uses of animals in wars or abuses. I also pose this question to you to think more about it, whether any kind of use of animals in the armed conflict is abuse or not. Because some of the uses of animals, in fact, most of the uses of animals in armed conflicts are not prohibited under international law. They might not be explicitly allowed, however, they are not prohibited either. And that actually gave permission to the parties to the conflict throughout the ages to use animals in multiple ways. Here is the non-exhaustive list of different uses of animals in armed conflicts. For example, animals have been used as a means of transportation for humans, materials, or supplies. Animals have been used in wars as a means of delivering messages or as in combatants who carry weapons or guarding military objectives. Or animals were also used in a military research or experimentations to develop and test new weapons. Animals have been used and are being used for detection of explosive, especially the mines. And sometimes animals also have been used as companions to raise morale in the army. And as I mentioned, this is a non-exhaustive list, and there can be other uses of animals in the armed conflict, which are not prohibited under international law. However, this still can be seen as an abuse of animals for few reasons. First and foremost is the consent, because we know that animals are not able to give a genuine consent of their participation in an armed conflict in any ways. And the secondly is the animals, the ability to, or even disability to understand what is really happening. So for humans, it's clear when there is an armed conflict, right? So we understand what's happening. We understand there is a war. We understand that can bring a suffering, etc. But for animals, this suffering is not really clear. They don't really understand what is going on. They don't know what to do or how to react if there is a danger. And most importantly, they have been put in this danger by humans. So their suffering is a human-made. It's not a natural-made suffering. And that's why the uses of animals in wars can be seen as abuse rather than use. However, as I mentioned, in the law, it's not explicitly prohibited. So when we are calling it abuse, it does not necessarily mean that this is an unlawful act of from parties to the conflict. So we are now more talking about philosophical or ethical, from philosophical or ethical point of view. So answer to the first question. Yes, we do have animals in wars, and the history documented the many uses of animals in wars. And answer to the second question is that if we care about animals in wars, this does not necessarily mean that we care less about humans. Obviously, we should care about both human and non-human victims of the armed conflict. On top of the direct uses of animals, which I've just listed, and again, which was a non-exhaustive list, you might think of other ways how animals can be used in wars. We also have indirect effects of armed conflicts on animal populations. Here are some of the examples, which can also ring a bell from the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For example, destruction of natural environment and biodiversity always affects species of wildlife fauna, because their habitats are either damaged or destroyed, and they have to flee and find another place to live. At the same time, mass displacement of persons for the reasons of the war, so the war migrants, let's say, results in leaving a companion or the farm animals behind, and who remain abandoned, and usually starved to death, or at least roaming in the streets or in unknown places for them. Sometimes also fear of famine and food insecurities led the governments to instruct the population to kill their pets. This was the, for example, the occasion when the British government actually instructed the population to do that in the wake of the Second World War. Intensive urban warfare also poses a huge risk to lives and healths of zoo animals or other animals in captivities, like in shelters. Also, wildlife trafficking for financing wars or other hostile activities endanger certain populations. For example, elephants, where the trade in ivory is one of the main source for some of the non-state armed groups for planning and conducting their military activities in certain regions of the world. And also using of starvation as a method of warfare during a siege operation sometimes led to people, civilian population who in the besieged areas, to resort to a practice of pet hunting as a last option for surviving because of the food shortages. And this will be one of the patterns which we will be talking about, because some of the reports allege that during the siege of Mariupol in Ukraine, the population, some parts of the population actually resorted to this practice. And again, this is also a non-exhaustive list because the war can have, the other dimensions of war can also have an indirect effect on animal populations. Excuse me. And then we have a big question. Does IHL, International Humanitarian Law, protect animals in wars? The simple answer to this is no. Because if you look into the core IHL instruments, which are mostly the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, you cannot find the word animal in the text of all these treaties. But we still can find some rules which potentially can be applicable to the protection of animals, depending how we see or how we perceive animals. First, animals can be protected under the rules of IHL, which protect property, either private or a public property, because we know that animals in most of the jurisdictions are considered as a property, or at least the objects of a trade, either public or a private ones. So even the wildlife are usually perceived as a public property of a state, while the companion animals or animals in private shelters or private zoos can be seen as a private property. And we do have a set of rules in IHL which protects public or private property, and those rules will be applicable to animals if we see them as a private or public property. We can also apply the rules protecting the civilian objects to animals, because in some jurisdictions, animals are seen as an object. But here, the challenge is to qualify animal which can move itself as an object, because the commentaries to the additional protocol 1 indicates that the objects which are protected under civilian under the rules protecting the civilian objects are the ones who are inanimate objects. So mostly the items, those who cannot move by themselves. So even though some jurisdictions might see animals as an object, this does not necessarily mean that under IHL they can be seen as an object. Because in IHL we have basically the two paradigms, right? The IHL protects either like persons or objects. So, and they're like a different multiple categories of persons and multiple categories of objects, but we don't have a transitional or something in between. And animals are not persons under IHL, but they are not objects per se. So this can be this can happen only with a wide interpretation. Animals, especially the wildlife, can also be protected under the rules of IHL, which protect natural environment and biodiversity. Some authors and commentators also suggest that animals can also be protected as combatants, but not as a human combatants, but they advocate for a different animal combatancy, so the different category of combatants, which we don't have for now in IHL, but which we could have in the future. Animals can also be protected under the rules which protect objects indispensable for the survival of human population. However, this is a bit a paradoxical rule because the rule itself lists the objects which can be indispensable for human survivals, and livestock animals are listed among them, among those objects. But the idea of this rule and the objective of this rule is to prevent food insecurities or to avoid starvation and famine, which means that we are protecting animals not because they deserve protection, but because later they will be served as a food for humans. So I also pose this question to you, whether this rule can be seen as a protective rule for animals or rather contrary. And animals can also be seen as a part of freedom of religion, because in some religions, animals are considered as sacred beings. And especially in relation to the prisoners of war, we know that they have to be allowed to practice their religions. And in that sense, the animals can also find some protection under the rules of IHL. So in a nutshell, we don't have a rule, IHL rules, which specifically protect animals because they deserve protection by themselves. But we do have some other rules which can potentially be applicable to animals, depending on their status, depending on the places they are, and depending on the purpose of their uses. In the most of the cases, animals can be seen as a property. As I mentioned, the qualification of animals as property is much simple than the other, like an object or a person or a combatant or part of the natural environment, because we'll get back to this a bit later. But not all the definition of environment actually encompasses all types of animals. So the property can be the umbrella clause, the rules protecting the private or public property in IHL, which can be applicable to animals widely. Now we move on to how Russia's aggression in Ukraine affected or is still affecting animals in Ukraine. And as a disclaimer, we have to mention that the information available is not as thorough for now, because we know that some of the territories are still under Russian occupation. So we don't know what actually happened there. When the territories will be liberated, we might have more clear picture, or when, like broadly speaking, the armed conflict will be over, we might have much broader picture of the impact of the Russian aggression on animals. but at least the information which is available up until now, it already suggests a huge negative consequences of the Russia's invasion on animal world in Ukraine. First of all, the destruction of Novakakhovka Dam caused a massive killing of animals, a flooding of zoos, and destruction of their habitats. And this was already, I would say, immediately referred to as an ecocide by many commentators. And I believe there was a separate webinar on an ecocide. So I'm sure this was already mentioned in that webinar. At the same time, the zoos were targeted in at least 2 cities, in Kiev and Kharkiv. In some instances, the blockade of roads caused the cutting of food supply to farms, zoos, and animal shelters, which itself caused a starvation and the suffering of animals in those places. Huge bombardment campaigns in the areas surrounding to some farms also caused the farms to be set under fire and killing of multitude of animals. The dogs were used as trophies, and dogs were also used for mine sniffing and detection of explosives. And the most importantly, because this is one of the patterns we will be talking about, the scientists also detected a sharp decline of a dolphin population in the Black Sea, which is allegedly caused by the increased navigation of Russian warships in the territorial waters of Ukraine. This is also a non-exhaustive list. It's just a few examples demonstrating the huge impact of Russia's aggression on the non-human animals in Ukraine. And as I mentioned, now we speak on 3 main patterns, which is the first targeting zoos and the animals in zoos and how they can avail protection under IHL. The second is the Black Sea dolphin population. So whether the decline of the Black Sea dolphin population amounts to violation of IHL or international criminal law. And the third is the use of starvation as a method of warfare, which allegedly led some population to resort to pet hunting. We will mostly focus on the dolphins of the Black Sea because those are more like a clear example of the wildlife degradation as a consequence of a war. As for the zoos, there are few rules or few principles points which we have to take into account when we are talking about the animal protections in the zoos. The zoo itself, and not an individual animals inside, but the zoo as an object, as an infrastructure, its premises constitutes a civilian object unless the zoo is used for a military purposes, right? So if animals are inside the zoos, they are not protected as persons, but the zoo itself is protected as an object, and then this protection also covers animals there. But if zoo turns into a military objective, then even individual animals can benefit from the protection granted to enemy property, because as I mentioned, they cannot be considered as a persons, either civilians or combatants, but they are most likely can be qualified as a property. So even if zoo is targeted, even lawfully, animals who are there individually are protected as an enemy property, whether public or private, depending on their ownership. If a zoo keeps the species of wildlife fauna, most likely they would not benefit from the protection granted to the natural environment, because the wildlife fauna which are in the zoos are taken out from the natural habitat. So they are not they are not complementing the natural environment in the wildlife. but they are taken out from the natural environment and brought in the zoos for the exposition to humans. And therefore, the purpose of the wildlife in the zoos are not the same as the wildlife species in the natural habitats. And the most likely they would not benefit from the protection of the wildlife. However, there can be one exception. If the zoos run the conservation programs, because in some instances the zoos have these conservation programs, objective of which is not to breed these species for exposing or exhibiting to humans, but to reintroducing them into wildlife and to contributing the biodiversity. So in that case, even though these species of who are kept under the conservation programs are taken out from the wildlife, they still can claim the protection under the natural environment protection granted to the natural environment, because the aim of their breeding is to be reintroduced in the natural environment in the future. So this is something which we need to know about the protection of animals in the zoos. And now we move to the dolphins. I hope I still have around 7 or 8 minutes for that. So briefly to restate the facts, the scientists undertook the studies from March till July, and this is just the first 6 months of the armed conflict. We don't have a comprehensive study up until now, but I believe it will be much higher, because even for the first 6 months, the amount of dolphins who were killed in the Black Seas were around 5,000, which is a huge number compared to the total dolphin population in the Black Sea, which is around 253,000. So as you might know, the dolphins communicate with each other with the sonar signals. So when there is a increased activity of warships in the territorial waters or beyond the territorial waters, they intercept the sonar signals, which causes disorientation of the dolphins, confusion, and they don't really understand what's happening, and they end up eventually to be sunk and drowned to the shores of the territory of the coastal state. So this led to the scientists to conclude that the increased navigation of the Russian warships could have been a reason for the sharp decline of the dolphin population in the Black Sea. And now we have a question. The dolphins were killed, but it did not really affect the humans, right? Because they are part of the wildlife, so they don't really interact with humans that much. So if the dolphins are killed, even if in a huge multitude, whether this will be still something which is which can be protected under the under IHL, because international humanitarian law actually prohibits the employment of methods or means of warfare which are intended or may be expected to cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. I believe the other webinars also covered the main, let's say, like a core rules of the protection of natural environment under IHL. But the question here is whether the environmental harm, which is not directly linked to the human interest, is prohibited or not under IHL. In other words, or even more simple words, whether international humanitarian law is strictly anthropocentric, which means that it only protects the harm which is somehow connected to human interests, or it can be an ecocentric as well, which means that IHL can also protect natural environment or wildlife as part of natural environment, not because they are important for humans, but because they are important intrinsically by themselves. I can only, I will not go into details of that. I can recommend maybe a book by our distinguished commentator Anne Dinelt, which closely examines the anthropocentric or ecocentric nature of the norms of the natural environment. But to me, it seems that the environment, the protection of the environment, which is granted under IHL, can be extended to dolphins or any kind of wildlife, even if they are not, even if their interests are not directly linked to the human interests. And therefore, the damage to the Black Sea dolphin population should definitely be seen through the rules protecting natural environment in an armed conflict. But now we go to the rules which are protecting natural environment, and we find out that the threshold set under these rules are so high that it makes it almost impossible that to be satisfied by the conventional warfare. So even if we assume that, going back, that the 5,000 dolphins, and again, this is just the first 6 months of the war, of the armed conflict, even if we multiply it on 4, let's say 20,000 dolphins are a huge number of the total dolphin population in the Black Sea, we still need to take into account the 3-part test, which is widespread, long-lasting, and severe. And only after that we can infer whether this damage was something which is prohibited under IHL or not. One thing which we should mention is that so far none of the environmental damage reached this threshold in any other armed conflicts. So it is probably less likely that the incident with the dolphins could also satisfy this threshold. But then we also have a possibility to, let's say, address this potential crime under the Rome Statute. But when we go into the Rome Statute, we see that the threshold is even higher, because the Rome Statute requires that there should be an attack, and the navigation of the warships per se does not constitute an attack, right? So the Rome Statute puts this extra element, and then it also says the 3-part test should be satisfied, which is widespread, long-term, and severe. And then, even if those 2 elements are met, the damage should be clearly excessive and disproportionate to the military advantage. And then we also have to have a special intent, which is required under criminal law, the intent of the perpetrator, the knowledge to commit a crime. So the Rome Statute puts even higher threshold on that and makes it almost impossible to prosecute the crimes against dolphins under the Rome Statute. But fortunately, we do have a national legislation of Ukraine, which is a criminal code of Ukraine, which criminalizes ecocide in a domestic system, and which says that the mass destruction of flora and fauna constitutes an act that under the criminal code amount to the crime of ecocide. And the commentaries to the criminal code of Ukraine indicates that the mass destruction should be interpreted as the complete annihilation of fauna of a certain region of the earth, or a partial destruction which extends to the large multitude of animals. Now, I'm not a good expert or a big expert in Ukraine domestic legislation, and I'm sure the other speakers or attendees know even much more on that, or the webinar which was on ecocide also covered this issue. But to me, it seems that the threshold set under the criminal code of Ukraine is the lower, which makes it more feasible to prosecute the crimes against dolphins under domestic law than under international law. Because if we go, you see on the slide, the threshold from higher to lower, the Rome Statute has the highest threshold, The additional protocol 1 has the lower but still really high threshold, and then the Criminal Code of Ukraine seems to be the best avenue for prosecuting this crime and putting in practice the prosecution of this crime. And lastly, I also want to speak, okay, this gives a hope that this was the penultimate slide, so I will finish very quickly. When we are talking about the eating pets and birds by civilians and combatants, and especially there were reports from the besieged city of Mariupol, first thing we should bear in mind is that IHL does not prohibit the conduct by civilian population unless it's a violation of some laws, right? So the IHL is mostly focused on regulating the conduct of the belligerent parties, so how they should conduct the war, not the civilians. Civilians are mostly enjoying the protection. So if we have civilians who are eating the pets or pigeons or, I don't know, stray animals in a besieged city, this does not necessarily mean that this is a violation of the IHL. No, we don't have any rule which prohibits civilians to do so. However, this kind of conduct can be prohibited under domestic law. So if it comes to the prosecution, who should bear responsibility for this conduct? Obviously, we cannot claim that the civilians who resorted to this life-saving practice should be prosecuted or should be held responsible for that, but rather the military commanders who used the siege warfare to starve population inside the besieged areas and to use the food insecurities, which eventually led the people to resort to this life-saving practice of eating their pets or stray animals. So if we are talking about the responsibility, first of all, we should know that IHL does not impose any responsibility for civilians if they start eating animals as a life-saving practice. But IHL can impose responsibility on the military commanders who caused starvation because they used the starvation as a method of warfare. And if under any domestic or any other jurisdictions, the crimes against the animals can also be prosecuted, then the responsibility should be, the responsibility should be, the commander should be liable for this and not the people who actually resorted to these life-saving practices. I think that's it. I tried to very briefly cover everything which I wanted to talk. I hope I'm still on time because we have around 15 minutes for the questions and discussion. I think, Anne, I now turn over to you.